are joining our call today, or our webinar tonight that wasn't with us last night. Welcome to the folks that are returning. Thanks for coming back. My name is Hank McNell. I work for Rutgers Cooperative Extension in Warren County, and I am part of the Animal Agricultural and Field and Forage Working Group. And my colleagues here tonight are Dr. Carrie Williams, who's the equine specialist and animal science professor at Rutgers, Dr. Mike Westendorf, who is the animal science extension specialist and animal science professor at Rutgers, and then Steve Komar is the agricultural agent for Rutgers Cooperative Extension in Sussex County, and Bill Bamka is the agricultural agent at Rutgers Cooperative Extension in Burlington County. Tonight's session will be focused on horse pasture management, and the third seminar in our series will be next Monday at the same time, 7 p.m. And Dr. Westendorf and myself will be talking about livestock pasture management. So, Dr. Williams, if you would like to kick off our exciting event tonight, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hank, and thank you everybody for joining us. Again, if you were online with us yesterday, welcome back. If you are new to the webinar, thank you for joining us. I am happy to take any questions during it. However, it might be a good idea to ask them in the chat box, if you will, or in the Q&A area, and the gentlemen will either answer the questions for me or they will interrupt and I can answer them at the time. There should also be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So let's get started. I think really what I'm going to talk about that's going to be different from what you listened to yesterday is really horse specific and the importance of the pasture for horses. So we'll talk about a little bit about grazing systems. We'll talk a lot about the nutrition of the horses. So before I get started, I always like to get everybody on the same page. So when we talk about pasture, what do we mean? What exactly is a pasture? So really the definition is an area of land that's usually a half acre or more where grasses and legumes are grown for the purpose of supplying nutrients to grazing animals. So there are a couple things in this that are very important to understand. First off is grasses and legumes, so clover, alfalfa, whatever might be in there, but that's important. There has to be grass in the pasture in order for it to be considered a pasture. If you have an area that's brown or dried up or dirt, that is going to be called an exercise lot, dry lot, stress lot, whatever you want to term it, but it is not a pasture. You can say paddock if you want. And then it's for the purpose of supplying nutrients to the grazing animals. So these pastures will contain plants that have carbohydrates, fats, proteins, vitamins, minerals, and even some water in it for those horses. So that brings me to one of the first things that I want to ask everybody and what way we're going to do this is if in the chat box you would answer just by easily typing in A, B, or C for me. Do you think that pastures can provide 100% of the nutrients that a horse needs? So go ahead and type A, B, or C, and the guys are going to hopefully quickly try to do a rough tally, see if you guys are right. So we got A, yes, B, no, or C, it depends. I know my extension colleagues will laugh because that is an extension answer, right? I can kind of quick glance over, I see some A's, some B's, and some C's. Can the pasture provide 100% of the nutrients of horses? What do we think, guys? Do we have a consensus yet?
It looks like yes is in the lead with depends also showing up.
Sounds good. Well, we're going to run with that because my first instinct also says yes. However, it does depend. It really depends on the type of horse you're feeding. Horses at maintenance, so the typical pasture pet typically can maintain all of its nutrients on 100% pasture. Granted, again, it depends on the quality of pasture and a lot of other things, but typically good quality pasture, these guys, like the one over on the right, he's nice, fat, and plump. And granted, this is a little bit of an early spring pasture, but it can maintain all of his nutrients. Lactating or growing horses, no. So that's why it does depend. They do not have all of the nutrients that they will need. They won't be able to eat enough to get enough of their energy demands from the pasture. Some pastures might also be too low in protein. So that way it does depend. And for the most part, lactating growing horses, no. For exercising horses like these guys, maybe. Some horses, it really depends on how intensely they're exercising. This just so happens to be my horse in the corner. When we weren't competing really heavily, it did. She was on pasture alone and did just fine. However, once we got up to prelim, I needed to start adding a little bit more energy and some balancer rations for her at that level. So, good answers. So I went on the Dairy One, which is also Equine-analytical. I went on their feed database and I looked at the average nutrient content for grass pastures. And really that's all you get is mostly grass or mixed grass pasture. And you can see here we have an average, we have the average of, there must be 10, 20,000 samples in this average. So there's quite a lot. And you can see up here protein. Protein is always listed first at 15.3%. So I'm not sure, and you can type in the chat box as well, how much protein do you think a horse needs on a daily basis? And is 15.3 enough? Give me a minute. Let's see if I can see anybody that wants to take a quick stab at the answer to that. How much protein does a horse need on a daily basis? First come, first serve. Who's going to answer this one? Anybody? Nobody's going to take a stab yet. Oh, there you go, 10%. So yes, at maintenance, 8 to 10% is all a horse needs. So this pasture, again, would be just fine. Some young growing horses or lactating mares can go up to 16. So this might be just a little bit shy for them. But then you can also see, oops, sorry, no animations there. You can also see there's sugar in it, starch, more the non-structural carbohydrates, which we'll talk about really briefly. But there's also fat in there. And then there's the calcium and phosphorus, nice 2-to-1 ratio there that horses need. So really, depending on the horse, it can provide, an average pasture can provide all that the horse needs. So we have to remember that horses are grazing animals. They've evolved as grazing animals. They consume forage in small meals throughout the day. They graze 12 to 16 hours per day, some of the research has shown. However, actually, we put some GPS monitors on these horses for some studies that we did, and we found that they grazed even up to 17, 18 hours, so they can graze even longer. They can consume anywhere from 1.5 to 3.3% of their body weight per day in forage. And again, this depends on the animal, the type of horse. Some studies even shown that ponies can go up over 5% of their body weight. Now, I like to do easy math. That's why I always say all of my average horses are 1,000 pounds. So what's 3.3% of 1,000 pounds? That's 33 pounds a day. So that's quite a lot of, and that's in dry matter. So if you added something that was, 20% dry matter, you're eating an awful lot of grass with all the water in it. They can also cover quite long distances while they're walking 20 kilometers. And again, these GPS monitors we used did find them right around the 11 to 12 mile range per day. So that's about right. They are able to digest very large amounts of forage, but depending on what they are going to be doing, whether they're at maintenance, etc., they might need too much. So some more horse feeding basics. Horses should consume at least 1% of their body weight per day in forage. And I think that's low. I think that's on the low end. Maybe for a horse that is, 9, 10 months pregnant. But I think most horses should get 1.5, even 2% of their body weight in forage per day. I always say you need to maximize forage intake. And then whatever else is left over, then you can add in a grain or a concentrate or whatever else they might need. Definitely maximize that. So my 1,000-pound horse will require 2 to 3 acres of pasture in a growing season, just over the growing season, to meet its nutrient requirements for maintenance. This is during, like I said, during the growing season. So that's 2 to 3 acres for horse. And that is if all you want to feed it is pasture. And that's a decent quality pasture. And we're going to talk about some things that we can do to kind of help the pasture along, or what we can do if we don't have 2 to 3 acres per horse. And then I mentioned horses that are in some sort of production, whether it's late pregnancy, lactation, growth, they might need extra requirements to add to the pasture. So if a horse is eating a lot of carbohydrates, say in a grain meal, so say this is a grain meal, even though it looks like chaff, a lot of these excessive carbohydrates, the soluble carbohydrates, might be spilled over into the hindgut and not absorbed in the small intestine and be rapidly fermented. And this is when we can have problems like low pH, increased lactate. So we always try to decrease the amount of starch that a horse is eating. And the reason why I'm getting to this is because sorry, that one's a little bit too soon. Some pastures actually can be fairly high in non-structural carbohydrates. So this might be the reason why some people might limit the level of pasture for their horses, because they don't want them to take in such high levels of carbohydrates. So now I can move on to the next slide. It's my next poll question. So if you own horses, and you don't have to answer this if you don't own your own horses or own your own farm, but do you provide pasture for your horses? And you've got A, B, and C again. A is yes, you provide 24/7 access. That means you leave them out all the time, or most of the time. B, yes, but only about half the day, so they might come inside half the day, outside half the day. Or no, none, or very limited, like in a dry lot situation. So what do we got here? You can type it into the chat box, and we'll try to get a consensus as to how many of you actually do use pasture or provide pasture for your horses. A couple writing in. They all disappear. Depends. A's, B's, C's. C for pony. That's probably a good idea for the pony. Give you a few more minutes. I'll take my water while we're asking. Do you guys see anything more than me? I'm only able to glance at it briefly. So. A little bit old.
It looks like your A and B is probably the predominant one.
A and B, yep. Okay, good. So that's probably why you're on this webinar. So great. So yeah, then you probably know a lot of the advantages that pasture can have. It promotes healthy behavior, and all of these things have been studied. They've looked at exercise on pasture. They've looked at social interaction and the reduction of a development of some vices. So really good benefits in terms of behavior for the horse. They've also shown that it reduces the likelihood of colic. This is if horses are adapted to the pasture and used to being on pasture. I can confirm this actually, where I did my graduate work at Virginia Tech. We had 100 to 150 horses on 400 acres. They never came inside until they had a fall, and then they were inside very briefly, and then they were kicked back out. In my 5 years there with that many horses for 5 years, I saw one case of colic, one. And it was a gas colic. We walked her for a little bit and she was fine. So I think that's pretty good odds. Lowers the incidence of ulcers, so get the horse out, get them grazing all the time. There's always something in the stomach. Decrease chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or HEAVS because they're out in the open. Increases bone mineral content in young horses that are raised out on pasture. So all of these do have research proving their benefits. It can also reduce hay costs. So Rutgers developed a new rotational grazing site, which I'm going to talk about really briefly in a little bit. And we saved, with 12 horses in one grazing season, we saved over $3,000 worth of hay. So I know all of the farm manager at Rutgers is now convinced that we definitely need to maintain the rotational grazing site because they did save a lot. And right now they're really pushing me to get grazing those pastures, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Can reduce the fertilizer costs if you're going to spread the manure, and it looks pretty. It looks much prettier than a brown lot, right? So well-managed pastures can recycle nutrients. You don't need to deal with all the manure and the bedding that are in the stalls and in dry lots. It saves in labor costs, bedding, etc. So really, there's a lot of environmental returns just to have the roots help reduce the erosion, helps recycle nutrients, and we can go on and on. However, I do want to talk really briefly about some of the disadvantages, because some of you might be thinking, especially whoever mentioned that you have the pony, that you really wish you didn't have as much pasture, because it's really hard on ponies to be on pasture because of the high carbohydrate load and how much they can eat and overeat. But some other things are some weeds, toxic plants that might be in there, and I just threw up a couple brief examples because it could be a whole other hour-long talk just talking about toxic plants. But things like Jensen weed and pokeweed, some grasses like tall fescue that has the endophyte in it, and then some legumes like the L-site clover or the red clover, which has the black patch fungus in it. So there can be some problems. There's also a thought that it'll spread gastrointestinal parasites all over the field. That's why you need to have a good deworming program or do some fecal egg count tests. And I know we do that at Rutgers now, and there are some horses that we actually haven't needed to deworm in years because they just aren't susceptible to parasites. So I'm a firm believer in fecal tests. And just have a good manure management. And again, back to the people with the ponies, they could easily get laminitis because they're on the pasture with the really heavy load or the high soluble carbohydrates. And ponies are found to actually have it be hereditary, and they have a higher incidence of equine metabolic disease or laminitis, and it can be triggered by high carbohydrate load, high soluble carbohydrate. So we just want to talk a little bit about that, because this seems to be one of the questions I get more often than anything when I talk about pasture for horses, is what are some of the factors that affect the carbohydrate status in these forages? If I do have a little laminitic pony or a horse with metabolic syndrome, when can I turn them out, or can I ever turn them out? Well, it all depends on the forage species you have in your field. Cool season grasses accumulate more of those non-structural carbohydrates than either warm season grasses or the legumes do. The season and the temperature will vary. In May, they accumulate more NSC, sugar and starch than say in March or really, really early before the grass starts growing, and also more so than in the summer. And I'll talk more about this in just a little bit. Time of day, so they store NSC throughout the day as the sun is up. So as the sun goes up, the carbohydrates go up and up and up and up, and then as the sun goes down, the plants start to use the carbohydrates, and the carbohydrates go down. So they're greatest in the later evening before the sun goes down, and they're least in the morning before the sun comes up. And it all depends on if you have a shady or a sunny pasture too. Let's talk about some of these things. There are some other factors as well. During a drought, a few days during a drought, the grasses get very stressed, and they store their carbohydrates because they're waiting to use them when they get rain so they can grow. Also, if you don't have fertilized pastures, and this goes back to what we talked about last night, need to have good soil health in order to have good pasture health. Because if the grasses are stressed enough and they don't have enough nitrogen and phosphorus, it can trigger accumulation of the non-structural carbohydrates as well. So while I've heard some people say, I don't want to fertilize my pastures because I don't want them to be too lush for my horses, they're actually doing more harm than good. Highest NSC at the flowering stage as well, so don't let your grasses go to seed, because once they produce the seed to reproduce, that also has really high levels of starch in it. So again, the stems and the seed heads and the leaves are the different plant parts. Highest concentration is in the seed head. So try to make sure you're on a good mowing plan if you need to mow before they go to seed or get them grazed. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this too. I'm kind of setting up the stage for talking more about it. So some horses are at high risk for laminitis caused by the high soluble carbohydrates in these pastures. So I would avoid certain times of day and avoid certain plant types. So some of you might have heard the term fructans. Fructans is just one of these non-structural carbohydrates. They are rapidly fermented in the hindgut, which can cause a lot of problems for some of these horses. So in our plant cell wall, so in the stems of a lot of the plants, you've got the cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin, more structural component. That's not the problem. That is not the problem at all. Where the problem lies is in the non-structural carbohydrates, which is in the leaves or in the seed heads. So the sugars, the starches, and the fructans, which are inside the cells. And really, all these carbohydrates in general comprise about 70 to 85% of the dry matter of these forages. And the non-structural carbohydrate portion can be anywhere from 4 or 5% in some worm season grasses, all the way up to even sometimes 25, 30% in some of the cool season grass species. So what about the forage species? Like I mentioned, the cool season grasses have a higher potential for non-structural carbohydrate accumulation. Bad news for everybody here in the Northeast, those are the grasses that grow best in our pastures. So I know we've already had a couple questions about what grass species to plant. Well, things like Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, tall fescue are what we plant at Rutgers because they do very well in our soils. They have a very high potential for NSC accumulation. However, warm season grasses like Bermuda grass do not accumulate fructans, so they stay very low in non-structural carbohydrates. So those of you, if you are listening from somewhere other than New Jersey, that might be in North Carolina or south of there, can grow some of these warm season grasses, and actually they can stay quite low. My graduate student did a little bit of work with some of this, and some of you might have heard some of her talks in some warm season grasses. So again, fructans are fructose polymers. They're water soluble. They're in cool season grasses. Starches is another non-structural carbohydrate. They are polymers of glucose, similar to sugar, but a little bit different. They are actually the storage form of legume. However, they seem to cap out at about 4 to 5% in a lot of the forage species we've looked at. It can get a little higher. It can get up to 8 to 10, but there's a cap to it. It can't get quite as high as some of the sugars can or the fructans can in the cool season grasses. So fructans are going to be higher in the cool season grasses, like I mentioned. They're going to be higher in the sun areas, the sunny areas of your pasture, as opposed to shady areas. They're going to grow when there's ample sunlight, as opposed to overcast or shady days. They're also going to grow when there's a long photo period, so in the summer months, but really the early summer. And as we get into some of the summer drought, it's going to start to decrease again. So if you have some of these laminitic horses, which I'm sure there's at least a few of you out there, to try to avoid turning out your horses on cold nights. Because remember, the grasses are using all of these carbohydrates to grow overnight. If there's a frost, they're going to go dormant. They're not going to use those carbohydrates. So then in the morning, when you go to turn your horses out, they're little crystallized popsicles of sugar. And that's when a lot of, I've seen a lot of pony farms have a big bout of laminitis during cases like this. And also during drought. So this is a good picture of a Virginia pasture with a lot of drought in the summer months. You can turn your horses out on a greasy, overcast day in shady fields from about midnight to 8 a.m. So, you know, those of you who like to go to bed really late and are still up at midnight, go for it. Turn your horses out. And then bring them in at 8 o'clock, 8, 9 o'clock. And then on clipped pastures, don't let, you can see down here, there's a lot of seed heads in this pasture. So don't let the pastures go to seed. Make sure they're clipped, but not too low. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. So that's kind of the nutrition bit aside. Let's talk about managing your pastures now, depending on what horses you have. So I know I'm going to talk a lot about the average horse and the average farm, and then you can kind of think to yourself where your pastures and where your farm might lie. Because each manager is going to have to decide your own goals. Don't look at your neighbor because his goals are going to be different. Are you going to be able to only have a dry lot here or a turnout where you're just going to feed them hay? Or are you going to be able to have some nice lush pasture that you can potentially rotate? We'll talk about some rotating in a little bit. Or do you have room for both? Can you make a nice system with some dry lots for times of need and some pastures? And that's when rotational grazing is going to come into play. So what you really need to do, though, is make sure and be careful of your decisions and look at your finances. Look at your usable area, your time, your effort, the number of horses. We're going to talk briefly about stocking density because I know it was talked about yesterday as well, but I just want to, for those of you that are new, go over it again. And then your existing facilities. So, you know, if this picture on the left is all you're going to be able to have is very sparsely populated, overgrazed field because you've got too many horses and too few acres, well, then maybe that's it. But if you have room and are able to do some nice rotating, like the one on the left, this was one of my previous graduate students, some of you might remember Laura Kenny. She's going out to rotate these horses that are in this little laneway waiting to go into the next field. So there's options, there's a bunch of different options. So first, you should consider stocking rates. So it may or may not be typical to have 2 or 3 horses per acre or more. I've seen it 5 horses per acre. Okay, well then maybe it's better to have an exercise lot and not try to worry about your pastures. But you're going to be feeding a lot of hay. However, if you're a farm that really wants to use pasture as a source of nutrition, either a sole source or a partial source, then there's some things you can do. You need to maintain your animal densities so that the forage is at 70% vegetative cover. So let's go back to this picture. If I were to put a square here and throw a couple pins on the square, is this going to be 70% vegetative cover? I'm going to guess it's more around 50. So it's probably pretty low. What about this field? Other than this little lane right here, I would say that's probably close to 95% vegetative cover in that area. So you really need to kind of look at that. So what can we do? Well, let's jump to this last bullet here. If you have 1 horse and it can be maintained on over 2 acres, then you can turn it out full time and have 100% of their nutrition coming from that pasture. However, if you've only got 1.5 acres per horse, you might need to limit the turnout time, and you might need to put them either in a stall or a stress lot and feed them some hay or some additional grain or whatever. Same if there's 1 acre of pasture, 1/2 acre of pasture, you can adjust the amount of hours that those horses are out on pasture in order to keep your 70% vegetative cover. So this slide is doing 2 things. It's allowing 70% vegetative cover on your pasture, and it's allowing the horses to have some nutrition come from that pasture. So I know this was mentioned briefly yesterday as well. So these stocking rates can be varied, and they can be increased with good management, like mowing, irrigating. We really don't do it. But if you have the opportunity to, great. Fertilizing, overseeding, rotating pastures, etc. And a lot of this was talked about yesterday. We'll try to get the archived link to it posted. If we get a chance, I'll send around an email so that you guys can look back. There's also the fact sheets that I see have kind of been going up in the chat. So check out those. So what I want to talk about now for just a little bit is rotational grazing, because we talked about it a little bit yesterday, but we've got some new data out there from some studies that Rutgers have done, and I want to just talk with you a little bit about some of these really cool findings. So my poll question next that you guys can type in the chat is, do you use rotational grazing in your equine management plan? So A, if it's no, B, if it's yes, but you rotate by using the horses in a stall, or C, yes, you rotate using a stress lot, dry lot, sacrifice lot, whatever you want to call it as well. Then I'm going to talk about the proper way to rotationally graze. So I know right now you might be thinking of a certain type of rotating, but I'm going to actually tell you in a little bit the proper way to rotate. Got 2 pastures back and forth. Yeah, that's option D. Looks like B, C, B, C, A. Yeah, we're kind of all over the place, right, guys? Is that what I see?
Yeah, pretty much over the place. You got a lot of sacrifice lots too.
Good, great. Like to hear that. Like to hear the sacrifice lot. So let's talk about that. But before we talk about that, I have to make my extension educators proud of me, my extension agents proud of me for talking about some plant physiology. Even though I am not a plant physiologist, I have learned from the best. And I have learned while I've been doing a lot of rotational grazing. And it's important for everybody to realize how grasses grow. They don't grow from way up here, the top of the plant. They don't grow from the very tip. They also don't grow from all the way down at the very, very, very end of their roots. They have what's called growing points, and their growing points are situated throughout the plant. There are a few buds that lie down kind of at just under the surface of the plant, which can sprout up. And then there's buds that elongate. So this shows where the growing point is. As the stem elongates, it creeps up and up and up the plant. So while it's not at the very top, it's also not at the very bottom, it's throughout the middle. And this is important to know when we start grazing our horses, because we like to try to use this take half, leave half rule as we're doing the rotational grazing. And the reason for that is because as you're grazing, if you only remove the top 10% of the plant, the roots continue to grow and that plant continues to flourish. So let's look back at that plant. So here's this top 10%. If you only take off this little tip, you've not affected the growth of that plant at all. 20, 30, even 40%. I'm going to flip back and forth. So right about here is probably 40% of that plant. You haven't removed any of its growing points, and this plant is still flourishing and still able to grow. However, 50%, now you're starting to graze at some of the root buds. 60%, now you've killed off or you've stopped about 50% of that plant's growth. So now we're down here and we've removed both of these growing points. Now it can only grow from these down here. Even 70% of that plant, now you've stopped almost 80% of that plant's growth. By the time you overgraze your pastures like you saw in that one picture, you've pretty much stopped all of that plant's growth. We've done a study to show that even 8 months without grazing during a grazing season, the pastures will not grow back. So you've already pretty much destroyed any hope for your pastures to come back unless you do some serious renovating. So what do we want to do? We want to keep the grasses in this fast growth time. You want to keep them out of the slow growth, which is about less than 3 inches. So we need to try to get the horses off of pastures or move them before they graze them below 3 inches. What this also means is we want to try not to graze the grasses until they're over. We don't have to wait all the way until 10 inches, but between this like 6 to 8 inch range, we can start grazing horses. And that way they have some time to graze the grasses in this fast growth period. So when we're doing the rotational grazing, great idea to use a stress lot. And the key is here so that we can rotate these pastures so that it allows our field to rest and regrow. So I'm very proud of my little animations here. It took me a long time to do this. So I'm going to share my little rotational grazing system here. We've got 4 sections in a big square lot. Okay, it doesn't always happen this way, but let's say it does. We've got the stress lot, sacrifice lot, dry lot, whatever. It has the shed, the water, pans for feed, maybe some hay feeders, etc. Let's say all these gates are closed because they should be now. Right now, our pastures are only at about 4 inches. Okay, I know all the farm managers out there think, yes, we can start grazing, but I'm going to resist and say, no, we need to wait until they're at least 6 inches. Once they are, we can go ahead and open gate 1 and put all of our horses into gate 1. And I'm sorry I didn't close my gates. I probably should have spent a little more time and closed gates 2, 3, and 4. So they only have access to 1 and the stress lot. Once they've grazed that down to 3 inches, now it's time for them to move. We move them from 1 to 2, and now we close gate 1, gate 2, and that's all they have access to is 2 and the stress lot. And we graze that down again. Once there's 3-inch height, we move them again, now into 3. Once that's grazed down, now into 4. So the trick here is once or it's been all grazed down, where are they going to go? Well, hopefully, and in the spring this is the case, the number one pasture has had plenty of time to grow back, and it's now over 6 inches, and you're able to put them back into field 1. However, in the summer, a lot of times there isn't enough rain. It might be a little droughty, or the grass is starting to go a little more dormant because we have such hot weather. You're not going to be able to put them back on one without destroying your field. So you're going to have to put them back in the stress lot and maybe feed them some supplemental hay in the meantime. So by doing this, and actually really you can do this and pretty much maintain horses with the proper stocking density on pasture the whole growing season without destroying your field. And this is what we did at Rutgers. We had two rotational grazing systems and 2 continuous grazing systems. And we compared for 27 months. We started in August and we grazed all the way through 2 Novembers. So we went all the way out 2 Novembers for a 2.5-year cycle, a 2.5 grazing season. And we found some pretty cool results. And I'm just going to share these graphs with you. I promise there's only 2 slides of data. But the reason why I want to show you this is because you can see July 2014 when we took our baseline samples. This is herbage mass. So this is the mass of grasses that were available to the horses. This graph on the bottom is the height of the grasses. So how tall was it? Granted, it's in centimeters. But this 15 centimeter mark, that's grazing height. So that's about 6-8 inches. So think of that. Anything below 7, so 7 here would be too low. That's below 3. So you can see they all started off equal in the first grazing season. So this was July, September, October, and November. They all were the same. However, the continuous horses that are in blue kept eating all winter long. All winter long, all summer long, all winter long, and all summer long. However, these rotational horses came off. They were fed hay in the winter, and the fields were allowed to rest. Then when they grazed again in May, look at how much grass they had available all summer, even when there was a little bit of a drought. And then even all the way up, we grazed this year all the way till December. So we had that much grass for these horses to graze all summer long. All grazing season, and even into the next grazing season here, you can see how much different it is. Meanwhile, the continuous fields never really gave the horses that much to eat. And same with the sward height. We were able to get some really nice sward heights, probably so much so that if we would have had haymaking equipment, we probably could have got a batch of hay off in the early spring, or we could have had more horses. So we also had vegetative cover analyses. So these fields, other than this one period of time right here in January, so we had a dip below 70% vegetative cover in January. And then right here in the continuous field in March, this is early spring in March. This one is right at that 70% level in the rotational horses. Otherwise, again, you can see these rotational grazing horses were much higher, both vegetative cover and total cover. Is there a question?
Carrie, you have a question about stocking rates between the continuous and rotational in the chat.
Exactly the same stocking rates. So we had 4 acres of pasture for 3 horses on each pasture. So we had 4 times 4 times 4 times 4. We had 3 horses in each one. So each horse had just over an acre to graze in all 4 systems that we did. So they were exactly the same stocking densities. All of these fields were exactly the same size. We used some Google Earth photos, and we spent a lot of time actually planning out our pastures so that all of the pastures were identical and all of the grazing sections were identical. We had 4 grazing sections and in each rotational system. I'm sorry I didn't show you more. I didn't think I would have enough time to go over this a whole lot. But if anyone's really interested, hopefully this paper will be published soon. It's right now at the journal looking to be published. So I'm looking forward to having some really exciting results from this. But this was 27 months worth, and this was Laura Kenny's master's thesis. It was part of it, and she's now a Penn State extension educator in Montgomery County. So if you're in Pennsylvania, you can give a shout out to Laura. So in the end, I think your farm needs to be very flexible, because when we did that 27-month worth of grazing data project, we had a period of this one summer, actually it was the second grazing summer, where we had a pretty big drought. And we had one of our rotational systems that just wasn't growing back. So instead of sacrificing it and say, you know what, forget it, eat it anyway, we did have to bring them in the stress lot. We did need to feed them hay. But we still had really nice grass grow back after the drought. So we didn't have a total loss cause. You got to plan ahead, you got to adjust. You might have 7 days on your pasture, you might have 14, you might have 3. So it really depends on the growing conditions. Great growing conditions, you know, once we hit around May 1st, it might actually be really nice this year. I think we're about 2 weeks ahead of schedule compared to the last few years that we've seen. And I know some of the Farm Bureau reports have shown that even the farmers are reporting that we're about 2 weeks ahead of schedule this year. So we're looking forward to getting some grazing time. You might have to adjust your original plan, keep lots of records. Speaking of adjusting our original plan, it took us 2 years to get the grass seeded and planted in order to start the study. Because the first year, we got the seed down too late, we had a lot of rain, and we had a lot of geese. So we had nothing come up in our fields to use for pasture the next year. So we actually had to delay a whole year because the planting didn't work out. So, you know, Rutgers isn't any different than you guys out there that are struggling with trying to maintain pastures for your horses, but it can be done. You just might need to adjust some of your plans. So in conclusion, and I did leave time for plenty of time for questions, which I've seen a couple pop up that I haven't been able to look at closely, but we'll definitely answer some of them. But there is some negative conclusions that, you know, really large intakes of non-structural carbohydrates might lead to some problems with some horses. There can be an influence of some of these non-structural carbohydrates that a lot of horses can't handle. However, not all horses are like that. Some can handle it just fine. So there's a lot of positive conclusions as well, that good pasture system will provide really healthy living environment for these horses and can also give you a lot of really nice environmental returns. The same project that Laura did, we looked at soil, a lot of soil data. We looked at water quality data as well, and found that it doesn't just take a year to see the effects, but long-term grazing does really affect water quality of in and around the pastures, water infiltration into the pastures, as well as soil health. And that took about 2 years to see the effects of that. So I do have to give a shout out to some of my colleagues who helped with some of this presentation. Bridget Bird is one of the original, she's actually Macintosh now. She was at the University of Tennessee and at Virginia Tech before that. It was really one of the ones who first looked at the diurnal variation of the non-structural carbohydrates in pastures. So she's done some great work. And Dr. Amy Burke has also done a lot of rotational grazing with her site at the University of Maryland. So this presentation was put together as part of a grant way back in the day. And I know Steve and Bill, you guys are probably all laughing, and Mike, because I think this was one of my first projects when I started at Rutgers back in 2003, 2004. But still use these slides, and I still use a lot of the presentation. With that, I can stop sharing my screen and take any questions.
Carrie, you had one question in the question window about what do you think about turning out horses during the summer season when the grass isn't growing? Will it damage? Do you keep the horses in or out?
It can definitely damage it. So again, if you want to try to have your grass grow in the fall again, because remember, and I know you guys talked about this in yesterday's webinar, how the grasses grow. You know, they have really a good peak of grass in the spring and a peak of grass in the fall, and then that summer slump. So if you want to maintain good pastures and have them back in the fall, probably shouldn't graze them in the summer. And I know we do pull our horses off when there is a big drought, or, you know, anytime the grasses are below that 3-inch height, because we want to be able to graze into November and into December. Like I said, that one year we were grazing all the way into December, and that was great. But we didn't destroy the field over the summer. So, what else? Do we put oh, this is a good one, and I'm just glancing at this one now. Do we put the hay on the grass on the ground, or in a hay feeder? Hay feeder, hay feeder, hay feeder, hay feeder, hay feeder. Absolutely hay feeder. I don't care what kind of hay feeder. It doesn't need to be off the ground. It just needs to be in some sort of feeder. I have a really good colleague at the University of Minnesota who did a lot of research with a bunch of things. She did round bale feeders, she did slow feeders, she did square bale feeders. The amount of waste that you will have without a hay feeder will cost you double in the amount, or more, double in the amount of hay. So you're wasting half of your hay. So you might as well pay your hay guy double for the hay you're getting. That's basically what it is, double. And I've seen this, you know, whether you just throw a bunch of hay on the ground and then they kind of mash it all into the ground, you can save, I mean, yeah, there'll still be some waste with some hay feeders, and it depends on the hay feeder. And I don't know if Mike or anyone, if you can look up Krishna's hay feeder studies, she's got it posted on her website, the different hay feeders and the cost of the feeder versus how much hay waste. She looked at 10 different round bale feeders and 10 different square feeders. And every feeder was better than no feeder at all. I'm a firm believer of some sort of feeder. Again, it doesn't have to be high off the ground, because I know there's controversy as whether the head should be up or down. It doesn't have to be that, but it needs to be. Issues. I'm trying to scroll through some of these. If you guys saw a question come through, you can shout it out for me. Is there a max height that the grass should be grazing if it isn't seeding? Don't know if I understand that. Clarify for me if the max height that the grass, if it isn't like going to seed. You know, we grazed up to, we had like 24 inches at one time, which is really too high. You should definitely not let it get that high. Yeah, 12, 14 inches, you know, that's, sometimes it can be with some grasses before it goes to seed. But the problem is the horses aren't going to like it as much, because by the time it gets that tall, before it goes to seed, it's full of fiber, lots and lots of fiber in it. So what's going to happen is they're going to graze certain areas, and if the stocking density is too low, they're going to keep going back to those areas, and they're going to poop on the rest of the field. So they're going to use this lawn and rough system. So they're going to keep eating the small, short stuff because it's more sugars, more starches, and they're going to leave the long, really tall grasses that are close to going to seed because it's like an oat bran muffin. They're going to leave that behind and not eat it. So you should really, sorry, I'm getting someone talking in the background, so I'm not sure, someone needs to mute. But anyway, yeah, you should really try to get it grazing when it's like that 8-inch height is probably a good idea. Any other questions? Well, there's Hank had the Science Direct article. Is that Krishna's work?
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. What else do we have here? How long should you rest the field? That's a good question. It depends. I love that answer. It really depends. It depends on the season. In the spring, we found that about 20 days was good to grow back. However, in the summer, it depends on how much it's going to rain. We had one field that we were never able to graze the rest of the summer. It just didn't grow back until the next season. But really in the fall, if you've got decent weather, you should be able to start grazing again in 20 to 24-ish days. Might even be earlier if you've really been careful and you stopped your grazing. You just got to get out there and walk your fields. And I didn't have the famous picture that I usually usually have of, I think, Bill, it's you and Donna Falk walking the pastures at Riders Lane. I always use that because that's a really good tool to use. Get out there once a week, walk the field. Once a day, now that no one can go walking anywhere else. If you've got a farm, you can't go to the park. So, you know, you got a farm, go ahead and walk around your fields and just check them. Take a meter stick with you. Take a bottle of water. You know, bottles of water are what, 12 inches? So, you know, you can kind of get an estimate of how tall your grasses are. Set it down a couple times and see if you can get an average for how tall your grasses are. There's a lot of really good YouTube videos as well for looking at when to graze your pastures. I know Steve and Bill, you guys both have done some nice nice videos that are on the Rutgers website. So if you want to share those, go for it. It talks about when to rotationally or when to graze your fields and how to soil test and all that. What else? Anybody else? Any questions? Does each of the rotation lots need to be 2 acres per horse? Absolutely not. It all depends on how fast you want to rotate, how quick you want to keep things moving around. Like I said, we had about 1+ acre and change. Dr. Burke down at Maryland was about 1.5 acres per horse, but she also had haymaking equipment, so she was able to make a couple loads of hay because hers wasn't stocked enough. If you stock it a little too heavy, then you might need to rotate quicker. Now we don't have 4 sections, we've got 6, and we're using 4 horses on 6 sections, so we move them through the sections a little faster. So you really, whatever works for your farm, you can use just some of the electric tape and some plastic stakes. You know, as long as it's got a little bit of electric to it, the horses will learn pretty quickly that they're not to mess with it. That's the key, though. You need to make sure it's electric, otherwise they will totally take advantage of that. Yep, there you go. There's some good links for you guys. So you can start to click on them and look at those. How do we integrate time and weed management? Oh, that's a good question because I forgot to mention that. So if you go back to my little moving horses system, when the horses are in field 1, and they graze it down to 3 inches, average 3 inches, and then you move them to section 2, that's the time to do the pasture maintenance on section 1. So the first thing you should do is go through and mow it all down to 3 inches, because there's going to be some areas that might still be higher, and which is the roughs, and you want to get it all even. And there might be some weeds that are taller that you need to get mowed down as well. So mow it all back down and drag the manure through the field. If you do need to do any fertilizing or anything, that's a good time to do it as well. But usually just your dragging and your mowing needs to get done as you're rotating them. So then from 2 to 3, do your maintenance on 2. Sometimes, and actually we couldn't get farm crew to do each one individually. They said, well, wait until you get 2 of them moved. So they did 2 at a time. So you move them into 3, and then you fertilize or you mow and you drag sections 2 and 3. Best to do it right away, but you know, it depends on your farm manager and your farm health. So that's the best time to do it. Or, you know, come spring like now, we're not grazing, so I said, you know what, you guys need to get on there and get your nitrogen out in your fields before we need to start grazing the horses. So whatever you need to do now. Okay. Questions are slowly coming in. If they're done. Oh, here's another one, a drainage issue. I might turn this question over. I'm not great with drainage. When it rains heavy and everything turns to mud, I am worried if I implement a drainage system, my ground might suffer in a drought scenario. Oh, I see what you're saying. So if you have too much drainage, it's not enough. Better. I don't know. Steve, Bill, Hank, do you guys want to answer that one? I'm never good at drainage type questions. No, any takers?
Carrie, I think a lot of it would depend on the situation that we're trying to amend in our fields. Because sometimes by drainage, we're simply talking about managing the overflow across our pasture. I don't think we're talking about drainage tiles in this situation. So really anything you could do to maximize the water that's coming off of the field would probably benefit. But if we're talking about drainage tiles, that might be a completely different thing.
Hey, Carrie, I think this is a good time to point out the value of a sacrifice area. If animals are confined or have the option of being confined in a sacrifice area with feed and shelter, then it keeps them out of the pastures and it stops that mud accumulation.
Yeah, and really, we didn't have any mud in our rotational fields. We did have one area that was actually a natural spring. It didn't actually turn muddy because the horses didn't really have to go in it. It was just a little water. But yeah, if you have your stress lot, we actually had a little more mud in our dry lots than we were hoping we would have, but we didn't put down really heavy use pads. So we did have to manage the mud in the stress lots, but we had no mud in our fields once we started grazing. Our continuous fields, however, yes, they had a lot of mud because there were areas that just turned to dirt. And a lot of times there's no way to get rid of the mud, especially if you're feeding in that area as well. You have more organic matter and you have dirt, and that's a really good material. Good points. Oh, I saw a question from Sarah. I've been learning about crop farming and recently became aware fireweed exists. Could this be used as a chemical? Fire weeding, I'm sorry, exists. Could this be used as a chemical-free method on horse pastures? Time consuming. I'm going to throw that back to one of you guys as well.
I think she's talking about flaming there. And typically flame weeders work better in a row crop situation. You also have to be careful about not setting your field on fire. I've actually seen some fields go on fire with flaming. I think in a pasture situation, it would probably be a little bit more difficult, I would think, and it's going to take a lot of walking with it. You have anything to think of, Steve, about flaming on a pasture?
Yeah, two things actually, Bill. The one thing that you said is certainly true. It's going to take a lot of walking. The other thing to consider is we really can't selectively flame weed a section of our field. So if we have a weed that's close to a grass or a forage that we're trying to maintain, we're going to also affect that grass species as well. And the other thing, Carrie mentioned this a couple times already through her presentation, the act of going out there and actually clipping your pasture and dragging it and maintaining the grasses growing at their best possible health is really the most effective form of weed control. So just going through and actually physically clipping the sections as you go through would really help maintain your weed control.
Sorry, I'm also missing a lot of the Q&A questions too. Let me go through some of those. That one, slightly related question. Equitrol for fly control. Not sure I'm familiar with that product. Can be used safely on a garden? I don't know if you guys know that one. I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that product either.
Is there an advantage of using Tekapro? So we talked about this yesterday. Tekapro or Tekapoo. I know there's a bunch of different ways to say it. Orchard grass in a rotational grazing system. And yeah, if I can basically quote Bill from last night's webinar, Tekapro is really nice because it's not a bunching orchard grass. It'll spread more uniformly throughout the field, so you're not going to get those big clumps of grass. So it actually is really nice. Unfortunately, that wasn't the one that we used in our system, so I end up seeing a lot of clumps of orchard grass everywhere. But yeah, I think Tekapro would probably be your orchard grass of choice. I know a lot of people also ask, and this may or may not be in there, but is there a really what's the best grazing tolerant grass? And I've found, at least within our system, that the tall fescues work really well, especially the endophyte free, the endophyte friendly, whatever ones. We use Jessup Max Q in ours. And it really does withstand a lot of grazing pressure, and it does really well in the system. And the horses eat it just fine. I know some people seem to be concerned about that, but our horses love it.
Carrie, the one advice I'd give too is to stay away from Timothy in a pasture.
Yeah, I never recommend Timothy either. And Bill, it was the same reasons that you described last night. Horses love it too much. So basically they will destroy it the minute it's planted. So you're not going to have Timothy in your fields for more than a year. It also has some diseases that can grow in it as well. So it's really best for hay. It's not best for pasture. I hate seeing that in a pasture mix. What would you plant for, and I think we just covered a lot of this, for horses and ponies? Would you plant something different for horses? I always recommend just the Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, tall fescue mixes. I find that they do really well in this area. There are a couple others, smooth brome and stuff that you could, but the Kentucky bluegrass I like because it grows first. That seems to be what grows up earliest in the year, and the horses really do like it. But it's a very short grass, so you should really have some of the taller grasses in with it as well. And it doesn't persist to a lot of really. That was the first thing that disappeared in our continuous pastures. Should you drag manure across a field after you rotate? Yeah, we do. Because we found that a lot of times when the horses come back into the stress lots to drink, drink and hang out in their shed or whatever, they do a lot of their pooping in the stress lot as well. So we found that there wasn't as much manure in the rotational fields. If you had a continuous field, then you really need to decide, do you have enough land and horses? Is your stocking density okay that you can really do spreading? And Mike, I don't know, are you going to talk about spreading on pastures and stuff next week on the webinar? Are you going to do some manure management?
Not really. We won't be talking about manure particularly.
Okay. Well, we'll get back to you. Maybe we'll do a manure management one, and we'll really cover, some of the manure side of the pasture management thoroughly. And do we water our pastures? I wish we could water our pastures. I envy anyone who has an irrigation system, because we would have saved us so many headaches with a lot of our studies if we had water, but we just don't have the proper tools to water. Don't have any way to do it. I think we answered most of them. That was the Q&As that I looked through anyway. If anybody has any last minute questions, I guess we could, but I think we're at 8:05, so I can turn it back over to Hank. Is there any more closing words you want to say? But I want to say, yeah, thank you for everybody for joining on. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
Thank you, Carrie. So thank you for attending our second webinar series for pasture management. And again, if you'd like to see us again next Monday for livestock pasture management, it's the same time on Monday, 7 p.m. And it's a different link, but it's on the same flyer source that you saw to register for this event. If you have any questions for any of us, feel free to send me an email or anybody else on the team. And we want to thank you again for coming out tonight.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks.